Welcome to the Dole Institute. Is it on?
Yeah, you can take your mask off.
All right. So, I don't think it's on
Our
there.
microphone is not working out here.
I think he may. Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Tyler Liggett, and I am a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement with the Institute, including volunteering at programs and networking with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu or speaking with a student worker after the program. A video of today's program will be available on our YouTube channel soon. You can also access videos of past programs by visiting our YouTube channel at any time. A loop hearing system is available to use if you have T-coil hearing aid. We also have a limited number of listening devices. If you have questions about the loop system or at any time during the program have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members or student volunteers. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have questions, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able to and ask just one brief question. The Dole Institute mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now please join me in welcoming Associate Director and Director of the Museum and Archives, Audrey Coleman.
Thank you, Tyler. Nice job. Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you this evening. As Tyler mentioned, I'm Audrey Coleman, and I'm Associate Director of the Dole Institute, and this is my first opportunity to introduce myself to as the incoming Director of the Dole Institute. Thank you. I couldn't be more thrilled and honored. We have several special guests in our audience this evening, members of our Dole Institute Board of Advisors. If you would please stand and be recognized. Or just be recognized. And among them, a very, very special guest is the one and only Robin Dole, the newest member of our Dole Board of Advisors, and she is Senator Dole's daughter. We're so glad to have you here with us, Robin. Tonight's interview will be conducted by Dole Institute Director Current Bill Lacey and co-sponsored. I'm not kicking him out the door too quick. Our co-sponsors are Kansas Public Radio and KU's Department of Film and Media Studies. Please plan to join us next Tuesday, October 19th, for a conversation on race, part 4, in which we'll discuss the extraordinary life of cyclist Major Taylor, America's first black sports hero, and that will be featuring author Michael Cranish. You won't want to miss that. Tonight, we are honored to have with us Dan Glickman, here to discuss his autobiography, Laughing at Myself, My Education in Congress, on the Farm, and at the Movies. Dan Glickman served as Secretary of Agriculture for 6 years under President Clinton and represented Kansas's 4th congressional district in the U.S. House of Representatives for 18 years. So you know he's got lots of stories there. Also, he served as chairman of the Motion Picture Association of America from 2004 to 2010. More good stories. And also as a member of our Dole Institute Board of Advisors. I don't know whether you're going to divulge anything about that. Following the conversation, we'll host a book sale and signing so you can secure your own copy of Laughing at Myself. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Secretary Dan Glickman.
Thank you, incoming Director Audrey Coleman, from the outgoing Director, Bill Lacey. So anyway, thank you all for coming out. This is the biggest crowd we've had this semester. We appreciate your being here. Very pleased to see the numbers, especially given the continuation of the pandemic. Well, Dan, welcome back to the Dole Institute. You've been here before. We're excited to hear your stories tonight. Let's start with a very simple one that I ask almost every guest that comes. Tell us about your education and your upbringing.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Bill. Bill Lacey had a lot to do with my book because I couldn't find a publisher for a long time. And I called him up and I said, do you think you could connect me with the University of Kansas Press? And he said, I think so. And he did. And they published the book. So I don't owe you the royalties, but I at least owe you the privilege of being with you. And I'm glad to see my former colleague, Jim Slattery, my buddy. We served together for many years in the House of Representatives, and a lot of friends who are here. So I'm from Wichita, born, Wesley Hospital. I won't tell you when, but I'm going to be 77 years old next month. And I went through public school in Wichita. I graduated Southeast High School, went to college in Ann Arbor, Michigan, go blue, and then went to law school at George Washington University. And after that, I began work as a trial lawyer at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, and the rest is history. But I'm a public school graduate here in Kansas.
Okay. How did you first get interested in politics, and what was your first run for office like?
Well, I was the middle child, and I think that got me interested in politics because I had a brother and a sister that were constantly arguing and bickering, and they got my parents' attention. And who knows why you get interested in this business, but I think as a young boy I was always interested in working things out, getting people together, stopping the conflict, the bickering. I mean, I really do think that a lot of reasons people go into politics or any line of work is based on their upbringing. And I also had two parents who were very funny, naturally funny. Humor was endemic in our family. And so I think that I was just always interested in it. And I ran for the 6th grade president at Fabrique Elementary School and got elected when I was sick that day. They elected me. Then I went to college at the University of Michigan, where I was president of the senior class of the Liberal Arts College. And I would tell you that I had Republican leanings back then. And I was vice chairman of Michigan Students for Romney and Johnson in 1964. We all remember George Romney and Lyndon Johnson. And I remember going to the Detroit Metropolitan Airport, holding up signs, Michigan Students for Romney and Johnson. And LBJ came to campaign in Detroit, and he walked by our signs, and he looked at them, and he said, "You're half right." And so I'll never forget that as long as I live. I think I was just always interested in politics in college, and then I went to law school in D.C., worked for a Republican senator while I was in law school, Peter Dominick from Colorado, and then came back to Kansas, and the rest is history.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What were some of your the accomplishments you had in Congress that you're most proud of, and some of the lessons that you learned while you were serving in the House?
I mean, it's difficult to talk about accomplishments because the big thing, as Jim knows, is helping people who really can't help themselves. So you're an advocate and an ombudsman for people who have problems. Little people who don't have a lot of money and a lot of access, Social Security, Medicare, just problems with the government. Sometimes you're a psychologist for people to help them go through crises. And so there are too many of those things to mention, but almost every good elected official does that. But I'd say two things. One is I'm from Wichita. We made a lot of airplanes there. And I was very much involved in the aviation industry and helped pass legislation which I think helped save the general aviation industry, along with Senators Dole and Kassebaum as well. And then, of course, my involvement in agriculture, which I worked with Senator Dole, Senator Roberts, Congressman Slattery, and a lot of other people. And so there's probably too many things to mention in the agriculture world. But I was an eclectic, and I was a generalist. I noticed driving up here today, I drove up from Wichita, and I passed the sign in Chase County. It says, "Welcome to the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve." And that was introduced originally by Congressman Larry Wynn back many years ago, Kansas doesn't have much in the National Park Service system. And so in more recent times, I introduced the bill to create a national park for the tallgrass prairie. Ultimately, that became a preserve and not a park, but I'm still very proud of that accomplishment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I'm not sure why we're getting that. Can you tell us about your time as Secretary of Agriculture under President Clinton?
I had lost my election in 1994. It wasn't a great year for Democrats in the state of Kansas, right? And it's ironic because that year, Democrats lost 50, 60 seats. You left voluntarily to run for another office. And ironically, most of the people who lost were moderates, centrists. The more liberal Democrats didn't lose. It was the people in the center who lost. We got it from both sides, to be honest with you. So there are a lot of reasons why that happened. There was a sweep. Wichita became the center of the anti-abortion movement in the United States. Remember the Summer of Mercy, where tens of thousands of people converged on Wichita. And we also had the gun issue, which became a big issue. And then President Clinton had a health care plan. It wasn't the most popular time in the world. I'd spent 18 great years in the House and really loved it. But I ended it, I think, with my dignity preserved. Somebody asked me earlier today, was I depressed when I lost? I said I was depressed for one day. And then my dad said, get off your butt. You got to figure what your next step in life is. He actually said it more directly than that. And so I did. And life does strange things. And so I'm out looking for a job. And all of a sudden, fly to Los Angeles, and I get off the plane, and the white paging phone they used to have at airports. And it's my wife, and she said, Leon Panetta called, and he wants to know if you're interested in being Secretary of Agriculture. This was 10 days after I lost my election. And I actually had an anxiety attack right on the spot because I'd lost my election. I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I was being Secretary of Agriculture, and I went and thought about it, and it turned out that I probably would have given up my job as a congressman to take that position. But I had three great allies in that battle. One was Leon Panetta, who was White House Chief of Staff and who was in Congress elected with me. When you're elected in the same class, it's like you're in the same fraternity. Another guy was one named Al Gore. He was Vice President of the United States. He was also in my class, and so they knew me well. And the third was one Robert Dole. And because Clinton would have never picked me if Dole didn't give his okay, because Dole was the leader. And so Dole was very, very helpful. And so it was a good lesson in life that when one door closes, another door can open, unless you've made enemies in the process, unless you've burned bridges. And if you burned your bridges, then you probably won't have these opportunities. And so I tried not to burn bridges. It was a lesson I learned, during my congressional career and then afterwards as well.
Mm-hmm. How did your work as Secretary of Agriculture, if I can say the word, benefit Kansas? Well,
first of all, Dole and Roberts made sure that it benefited Kansas every single day, And in fact, there were a lot of people who thought that Kansas got preferred treatment. God forbid that would have happened under our leadership. But, we did a lot of stuff, not only in terms of the commodities in Kansas, wheat, corn, livestock, but also hunger, food stamps, issues that Dole particularly was interested in. He was the leader in the effort to build the modern food stamp, or now they call it SNAP program. He knew that it would help, it was the right thing to do. He came from poverty and had bouts of hunger when he was a kid during the Depression. And so he learned that you could do both. You could be an advocate for the farmer, but you could be the advocate for hungry people as well. And that started a coalition that we still have today between urban and interests, and not just urban, because a lot of rural folks are suffering as much as urban folks are, and the farmers. And so that was a real positive part of the job.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. I want to switch. One of the things we try to do is kind of long form, and it gives us a little time to get into stuff in more depth. But your career is so impressive that I'm going to have to kind of skip around rather quickly. But one of the things I really wanted you to speak to tonight, Secretary Glickman, is your time running the Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School at Harvard. That's, I believe, where we first met. I was visiting while you were director.
And you were a fellow there
I was a
early
fellow
on.
there in 91,
Yeah.
that's correct. Tell us about your time there.
Well-
How did you get selected, and kind of what was it like?
You know, it's like everything in life. It's kind of, somebody called me up and said the director was leaving. It was David Pryor. He was the senator from Arkansas. And so the Kennedy family, after John Kennedy died, created a fund, and they raised $30 million to build an institute at Harvard for political dialogue, very much similar to the Dole Institute. Half the money went to build the library, and a lot of you have probably been to the Kennedy Library itself. And half the money went into this institute that was largely geared to undergraduate students to help them build an interest in politics, doing a lot of the exact same things that you do here. And that $15 million, compound interest is a wonderful thing in life, because that $15 million grew to about $115 million. They may have gotten some additional outside money, but most of it was internally generated, and that produced an institute that did a lot of great things, and we didn't have to raise a lot of money, which was a terrific thing, So the $3 or $4 million a year in interest was enough to fund the operation, to have the programs, to have the speakers. They had the Harvard Forums, which is one of the largest lecture series in the world. They had Pizza and Politics, student activity centers, exactly what you're doing here. And, and I got to tell people I got admitted to Harvard. The truth of the matter is I applied to Harvard as a high school graduate, a senior. And I think my application got rejected even before it was received. And so I figured this is the way to get into Harvard. And I got into Harvard, and I enjoyed it. But then I got this opportunity to go to the Motion Picture Association, and we can talk about that if you want to. But I left a little bit premature in order to take that job.
Right. One of the things before we go to your Hollywood job, and I thought your your title here, your subtitle, laughing at myself, the subtitle is My Education in Congress, on the Farm, and at the Movies was quite clever. But
by the way, the folks at KU Press helped come up with that title.
Good.
You know that.
Talk about the importance of places like the Dole Institute or the Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School, or many of the other similar institutes around the country.
Well, I'll give you an example, because I sat with 3 really bright kids tonight at dinner. So I was the director of the institute, and we had the Student Advisory Council like you did, and we had, I think, some of the smartest kids at Harvard that were there and came to our functions. And there was this one kid that was really impressive, and he came to all the functions. He asked a lot of questions. He clearly was interested in politics, and today he's the Secretary of Transportation of the United States, Pete Buttigieg. And so you think that, you can have actual impact on people's lives. And there were a lot of kids who did go into politics per se, went into public service, and a lot of people went into business and other kinds of professions. But if you get them to understand the American political system, how it works, especially the practical aspects of how it works, and how you have to work together, you can, impact not only their lives, but the people around them and the society. And so that's what you're trying to do here and at most institutes around the country. And it is to give people an understanding of what politics means and how you can impact it. It doesn't mean the political science departments aren't important, because you got to learn about the history and what our Constitution's all about and why we do the things that we do. But unless you are where the rubber hits the road and kind of see the impact of it, and the way to do that is to bring in people of practice, people who've worked in the system, people who understand the system, and then to show people that you can make a difference. So, and that's why your institute is so important here. And then you have the luxury of having one of the great leaders of American history, named person on this particular institute.
What was the most satisfying part of that job, Dan?
I got to, well, two things. I got to help pick the speakers. And so we didn't just have political speakers. I love comedy. So I remember we had Jon Stewart come, and we had Mo Rocca come, and we had a lot of comedians, not comedians per se, but humorists come. And they were really an important force to kind of level the playing field and make it more interesting. And then, of course, we had for the presidential campaign. I was there during the 2004 presidential campaign, and we had all the presidential candidates come, and I remember this debate that occurred between most of the candidates. So that was also very interesting, and the students got to actually run that whole show.
Okay. Tell us about your time as chairman of the Motion Picture Association of America. You did that for 5 years, and if I recall correctly, your first visit to the Institute, you were talking about Hollywood and your role there. What was that role like?
So to give you some idea how I got the job, because it's clear that I don't look like Tom Cruise. And although my son is an actual movie producer, and he's been in the business for almost 20 years. And so we loved movies. So when I was in Congress, my wife would take my kids to the movies on weekends. They'd sometimes see 4 or 5 movies. I'd go with them when I was at home. I mean, we were big aficionados of movies, all kinds of movies. And so I get a call from a headhunter saying Jack Valenti is retiring. Some of you remember he was the longtime head of the Motion Picture Association, was a longtime PR guy for Lyndon Johnson, and was on the airplane when Johnson was sworn in. So Valenti liked me. I had served on the House Judiciary Committee, and I got other people involved, like Dole helped, Senator Roberts helped, Senator Moran was a congressman, then helped, and they chose me for the job. Didn't have a lot of experience in the movie industry. I mean, you know, I had to tell people. I had one guy with one of the studios said, "What do you know about movies?" And I said, "Well, when I was in the agriculture department, I used to grow popcorn, and now I'll learn to sell popcorn." It's an interesting world. It's not the job that I look at my career and think this was the epic of my life. I didn't have lunch with Angelina Jolie or Scarlett Johansson, or I mean, I did walk the red carpet a few times, and I thought to myself, my grandparents immigrated from Eastern Europe, and when I walked the red carpet, I would think about them and say, what do you think they'd think about their grandson walking the red carpet? But then I was shocked out a little bit, because one time I walked the red carpet and I was being interviewed by one of these. If you've seen the Academy Awards in the old days, I mean, the paparazzi dwarf what you saw in politics. One year there were 6,000 reporters. Can you imagine that, from all over the world? And so I'm doing an interview, and as I'm leaving, I hear 2 people in the back saying, "Who is that man?" So it wasn't as if I was the face of Hollywood. But on the other hand, there's a parallel between movies and agriculture. We export about 50% of our agriculture products. It's life or death to production agriculture to have access to foreign markets. And half our entertainment is exported to the rest of the world. In fact, agriculture, entertainment, and aviation are 3 big, giant export items, and I had a connection to actually all of them in one way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How did your time at the Motion Picture Association compare to politics?
It's so much tougher than politics. You can't believe it. I worked for the studio heads, and so I mean, personally, they all hoped that each other would fail every week, because the movies would come out on Friday or Saturday, and a movie might cost $150 million to make and market, and they were all having competitive movies, and there was tension, and I was the guy that was supposed to herd these cats around to make sure that they kind of loved each other. It's different than politics. Politics is tough, but in some sense, I think it was Valenti or someone says, Hollywood is Washington on steroids, and the stakes are very high. It's money, it's prestige, it's power, and so it was a much tougher job than anything I did in politics.
Okay. Let's get into some of your philosophical thoughts about politics and the importance of public service. Let's start with me asking you why you think respect and civility is so important to a functioning political system.
Well, I don't think, I'm going to go back to Senator Dole for a moment. He once commented, it was either a speech or a Kansas delegation meeting or whatever it was, he said, the only reason we're in this business is to get things done. Why else would you go into politics if you didn't want to make life better for people? And while it sounds corny, it's absolutely true. Why else would you run for office and deal what you have to deal with unless you wanted to do things to help people? And the only way to really be successful in this business is to be likable and friendly and not burn bridges. It doesn't mean you can't have strong views. And I don't mean this to be overly partisan because, I'm not. I mean, I'm a proud Democrat, but I'm not a rabid Democrat. And I've even given money to Republicans running for office. I've supported Republicans. But politics today is much more toxic than it used to be. I think a lot of it has to do with the metastasis of money in politics. I ran for office in 1976 against an incumbent Republican congressman and spent a total of about $98,000 total on the race. Jim, I don't know how much you spent on your first race, but it probably wasn't too much more than that. Pardon? $250. Well, today you'd have to spend $98,000 a week or $98,000 a minute in order to raise the kind of money that you need to raise. When you go to Washington and you try to become a candidate for office, the first question they ask you is, let's see what you're in your bank account. And, I was lucky. They didn't ask me that. I mean, I wasn't primed as part of nobody really thought I was going to win. But money in politics has really changed one thing. The second thing is the lack of independence. How I've seen it where party has become so important, and adherence to party, and the inability of challenging your own party and challenging your president and being an independent force where you need to be, and to support the president of the other party where he or she may be right. I mean, those are not attributes that are valued as much today. The media has changed dramatically too. I mean, we all know that we no longer have 3 television networks. We have 300 television networks. People listen to what they agree with. They tend not to listen to what they don't agree with. So and then in the House, at least, the way we've redistricted our congressional districts, we've made them largely one-party districts. Both parties have done this. I was very lucky, and I think Jim was too. We had congressional districts where we had to appeal to liberals and conservatives, which meant that you had to be very thoughtful and careful of how you voted and how you expressed yourself. And today, so you had to, as I use a football analogy, you have to be between the 40-yard line and the 40-yard line to really be successful. That was a great attribute, I thought. Today, if you're between the 40-yard line and the 40-yard line, you're dead meat. Because if you run in a congressional district where there are only either Republicans or Democrats, your base is going to be upset with you constantly, and you'll probably be challenged successfully in a primary. So those are all kinds of things that, have happened. And then character has a big thing. You look at Bob Dole, and you think to yourself, this man has character, good character. And we've had presidents of both political parties that have had good character. I mean, I was a big fan of both Bushes. I disagreed with the second Bush on a lot of issues, but I always thought he was a decent guy with good character, would treat people well. I didn't think so highly of our last president because I don't think he had good character. But that goes for other people in politics besides presidents as well. And if a person has good character, they'll usually make the right decisions, and they'll be better leaders.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about the importance of resilience, not only in politics but in life generally.
Well, I'll tell you this one quick anecdote because I was a designated survivor. Some of you remember the TV show, The Designated Survivor, with Kiefer Sutherland, and it didn't do very well, that show, but didn't matter. So in 1997, as the Secretary of Agriculture, they asked me to be the designated survivor. This is pre-9/11. And I didn't know what I was doing, but I said, sure. And so they said, well, you have to leave Washington today. The idea was that if the Capitol were destroyed or bombed, there'd be one person left standing. So they usually chose the Secretaries of Agriculture or Interior or Commerce for these jobs, what I call the important secretaries. And so I got chosen. I didn't get a lot of advice on what to do, but they picked me up and they took me on the private government jet to New York. I could have gone anywhere, but they didn't want me to go too far, and so they had some staff people, and they had a military guy with the codes with him, and they'd give me a little card about what to do if the country was attacked, but they didn't explain what I was supposed to do if the country was attacked. And so anyway, we went into my daughter's apartment. She lived in New York, and we had about 14 Secret Service people with me, and virtually everybody in her building in Lower Manhattan spoke Spanish only. So all I could hear is people whispering, "Immigración, immigración." And I said, no, don't worry, not an immigration raid, it's okay. And so we went upstairs, and I listened to Bill Clinton. He was supposed to give a 40-minute speech, gave an hour and 40-minute speech, nothing unusual. So after it was over, they said, Mr. Glickman, we're going back, the mission's terminated, and I said, I think I'll stay here with my daughter. So all the Secret Service left. I took my daughter to dinner, and we went to a Japanese restaurant in Lower Manhattan. I walk out, and there's a kind of blinding sleet storm, the kind of sleet that burns your cheeks when you're outside. And so we looked for a cab, and there was no such thing as Uber. And there, at that time of night, and in New York, there was no such thing as cabs. So we walked 13 blocks back to her apartment. And I said to my daughter, Amy, 3.5 hours ago, I was potentially the most powerful man on the face of the earth, and we can't even get a cab. and so what I tell people, it's a great lesson in resilience, because, you know, one is you got to realize you aren't the most important person in the history of the world. There's going to be ups and there's going to be downs. And it's how you deal with both of those that determine how successful you're going to be. And resilience is also being ready for the next step in life. So, you know, the old expression, when one door closes, another door opens. But that's only if you stand right next to the door. You know, if you're not there ready to go, it's not going to happen. And my dad used to tell this story about a big businessman who spoke to a high school class, and he said, kids, I have one piece of advice for you. You got to jump when opportunity knocks. And one kid stands up and says, that's a great story, and you're a successful businessman. But how do you know when opportunity knocks? And the guy says, you don't. And that's why you got to keep jumping all the time. And that's what resilience is all about, is being ready. But that only works if people like and respect you. And if you don't have that characteristic, it's a lot harder to move to the next step.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You've referenced humor a couple times tonight. How can a strong sense of humor be helpful in politics and again at large in life?
Well, you know, Eisenhower used to say that a good sense of humor is a great part of the art of leadership because it shows humanity, and it also shows kind of a self-deprecating spirit, that you can make fun of yourself in a constructive way. And most politicians don't make good comedians, so there's not I'm not talking about that kind of thing, but it's the ability to make lemonade out of lemons. So I found that I had a lot of experiences. They're in the book when I was a secretary and even when I was in Congress, where I was able to use humor to help rehabilitate. There was one case where we had a little issue in Congress having to do with checks in the House bank. Any of you remember that happened? So yours truly had quite a few checks at the House bank, and it was called Rubbergate. They called it bounce checks. They weren't bounced. They were the best checks in the history of the world because every one of them was paid. no matter what. It was just run like a cooperative, and so, you know, it hurt me. And I would go on parades, and people would say, "Hey, Glickman, how many checks did you bounce today?" And so my reputation was at stake. And so my wife and my chief of staff came up with an idea that we went to the local gridiron club, which in Wichita, there were several thousand people that went over a period of 3 or 4 nights to watch politicians make fun of themselves. So I went down there and I made up a song to the tune. I'm not going to sing it tonight, but
Are you sure?
I'm positive. To Sweet Charity, and remember the song was "Hey Big Spender," and so I walked out with an Uncle Sam hat, and I had fake dollar bills flowing out of my pockets, and I remember the lines. I won't sing it, but it said, "The minute I walked in the bank, they could see I was a man with good credit, a real big spender. But I got careless, just lost track. I didn't know I'd have to learn to add or subtract." And the place went crazy because, and then I had, and overnight that scandal dissipated. Now there are different ways to handle it, but I handled it that way. And then I had people came up to me and said, "You know, I did some bounce checks. The bank just charged me $15 a check. It'd be nice if they did that to you, Glickman, but be that as it may, but I use singing a lot as a way to, you know, kind of get out of jams once they had it. But humor is a characteristic that certainly nobody knows that better than Bob Dole, who is, you know, one of the funniest people in politics. There are not a lot of politicians today that have what I call a sense of humor. I think a lot of them are afraid. They're a little insecure that it might be on YouTube and their political record for the rest of their lives. And you know, we live in a period of political correctness now, and so you've got to be careful what you say. But in my case, I learned this from my parents. And my dad was, and my mother were both, you know, Jim knew my parents, and they were both, I could see my dad used to get business because people liked him. He told them jokes. He did funny things. And so I think that is a characteristic that's not enough there. And I don't know how you deal with it. You either have it naturally or you don't.
What do you believe Secretary Glickman is driving? What are the forces driving the intense polarization that we face today?
Well, I talked about some of them. You know, the amount of money in the system accelerates it. It's like it's a catalyst because most of the money is raised to destroy your opponent. So that's part of it. I think that courage and leadership is another part of it. To be honest with you, I get so frustrated when I watch people deny what happened on January the 6th when the visual images are there. I was driving up and there was a protest against the vaccine movement, driving up the street from the turnpike, and they were talking, the facts on their things were just, you know, wrong. And so I think that a lot of people get confused a lot between facts and opinion anymore. Senator Moynihan said you can have your own opinions, but you can't have your own facts. And I think that's kind of part of it. I don't know, you know, the nature of the media is different today, but a lot of it is good leadership and also a little bit of courage. You know, it's like I had a great career in politics, and I'm not saying I was the most courageous guy in the history of the world. I did a lot of things probably that were politically smart, but may have not necessarily always been what I would have truly believed in if I would have done exactly what I wanted to do. But on the other hand, I did a lot of things that I knew would be political problems for me. And that is missing today. Because you know what? If you lose, it's not the end of the world. And as my life has shown, you can do other things in life as well.
Speak to Senator Dole's, how he can serve as a role model for political leaders today, and speak a little bit about his legacy.
Well, he did so many things. The Americans with Disability Act, he worked with Tip O'Neill on across the aisle major tax legislation, and I mean, there's just too many legislative things. But I think his great legacy is two things. One, he's a great listener. He didn't have to talk all the time. You know, this idea that you just have to be, I get very frustrated when I turn on these 24-hour news shows, and just all you see is these members of Congress talking about all sorts of issues. Too much talking by these people, not enough doing. You know, Dole was on the shows quite a bit, but at the same time, he was always wanted to find a solution to a problem, and he'd work across the aisle. It was important, and some of his best friends are people like Tom Daschle and George Mitchell, who were leaders on the other side of the aisle. And I think he understood that to get anything big done, you had to work across the aisle. You know, to change the Social Security system, to change the way we looked at people with disabilities, civil rights. You know, these are a lot of issues that we're not dealing with today. And Dole wasn't afraid to deal with them as a Republican. You know, as a Republican, he knew civil rights was a big issue. It was a long vestige of history of the Republican Party, and it's kind of been dropped as a major provision of the Republican Party. So, you know, he still had strong conservative credentials, and I'm not saying he didn't have strong feelings about these issues, but I think his big point was he knew why he was in politics. It was to get things done and try to help ordinary people.
Okay. I have one more question tonight, then we're going to go to audience questions and answers. So please be thinking if you might have a question that you'd like to ask Secretary Glickman tonight, and you'll have that opportunity. We'll have a fair amount of time left. If you're watching online, watching virtually, you can ask a question too. You can send it to dolequestions@ku.edu. That's dolequestions@ku.edu, and we'll have somebody come out and ask the Secretary that. But my final question tonight, Dan, is when we walked in to the Institute after dinner tonight, you were greeted by a group of students. And obviously there are a lot of students here tonight and a lot of students involved with our Student Advisory Board. Speak to the importance of young people getting involved in public service.
Yeah, you know, first of all, I thank God there are a lot of young people actually entering politics, because, and it does make a huge difference, because they're not barnacled by the politics of being in office for a very long period of time, and they haven't staked out their positions yet, and they're open-minded. But a positive trend I see, to be honest with you, is I worked at the Aspen Institute the last 10 years, and I helped, quote, educate members of Congress, both houses, both sides of the aisle. And they're just a whole new group of younger members coming into Congress. Many of them are veterans, have served in Afghanistan and Iraq. At least half of them are women who served in these posts. You know, the demographics of this country are changing dramatically, and the demographics of Congress are changing dramatically. And most of these people who are coming in are younger people, and they're the ones that are going to really determine the success of long-term future of this country. So I'm optimistic. I'm not Pollyannish about it, however. My generation hasn't necessarily always produced the right results for these people, and there are newer ways of doing things, but I would say that the only way the country is going to maintain its leadership in the world and at home is through those people, the kinds of people who I saw coming into this room.
Okay. Well, we're ready for Q&A. We have at least one student. Do we only have one mic? Oh, we have two mics. Okay. Gotcha.
Here's a mic.
If you would wait, yeah, if you would, please wait for the mic to come to you. And if you feel comfortable standing, stand and ask one question, please.
First of all, Dan, I read your book, as you know, because we talked about it, and I thought it was terrific. And for those of us that have known Bob Dole, your words about him, which you said in part tonight, are much appreciated, and it was terrific. You had two experiences in your life that you described in your book. When you were a young boy, you got to go spend a day with Harry Truman and drive down to Wichita from Kansas City. And then later in life, you got to spend a day with Nelson Mandela. describe those experiences.
Okay, so quickly, Harry Truman, I love the name, True Man. He was one of the great presidents of the United States, and his name, True Man. He was a spectacular man, common man, no money, war veteran, not a good businessman. And he becomes president of the United States, and he's really responsible for a lot of great things, integrating the armed forces, and, he was a tough, strong president. But anyway, so, he retired with nothing, zero. And he came back to Kansas City, and there are a lot of stories about independence, actually, and he came back, and so he did a little bit of speaking, and he came down to Wichita to speak to a Jewish Israel Bonds dinner, and my dad was chairman. So we drove up to Kansas City and picked him up. This is 1954, I think. I was 10 years old. And imagine, we picked a Missouri Highway Patrolman, dropped him on the Kansas side. We then drove him to Wichita, and he's in the front seat with my dad, and he's regaling us stories about politics and everything else. And, I don't remember too much about it. I just remember that they laughed and they talked. And one thing he did say, I still do remember, was he said, "Watch out for this guy Nixon. I'm not sure I trust him." Okay, all right, anyway, it was like just an interesting thing. And, Truman could be crass, and he wasn't totally politically correct, but he was a decent guy. And when he went, when he left the White House, he didn't search for money for the rest of his life. Just think about that. He wrote his biography and made a little bit of money, and he stayed with Mama and his wife, and just kind of retired back to independence. And then Mandela. So when I was secretary, I took a trip, USDA, to Africa, and we went to Mandela's house in Johannesburg, and he, just a remarkable man. And we talked about his time at Robben Island a little bit. I was personally very interested in his relationship with the Jewish community in South Africa, because it was the Jewish community of whites who are most active in the anti-apartheid movement. And so he talked about a lot of his, he clerked. He was a lawyer, but he couldn't graduate from law school because of apartheid. So he interned or apprenticed at a Jewish law firm in South Africa, and then became a lawyer that way. And then we talked a lot about that, and so it was just, obviously you felt like you were in the presence of somebody who was just pretty unique type of individual.
Okay, other questions, please raise your hand. And okay, we got one back there, okay.
Yes. One of the issues of today is redistricting. And the last time in Kansas, it had to be resolved by the courts. What advice would you give both citizens as well as legislators with regard to redistricting?
It's a good question, because I think, I know that there have been some state legislative hearings on this, and I'm not as up to date on this as I should be, but I think the public should demand the best that, first of all, redistricting will always be political. It's just the nature of the beast. Both parties are going to want to preserve their strengths in this process. But to the extent possible, you should try, both in terms of state, but particularly in federal redistricting, to make sure that it's fair, that the districts do not look like Einstein's theory of relativity, that in fact the process is done in as bipartisan way as possible. Some states have done it that way. Iowa, for example. California has become more, they have bipartisan district commissions. That does not look like it's going to happen in Kansas. But only the people can kind of put the pressure on doing this. And it's tough, because the partisans don't want to do this. They'll do their best to protect the status quo. And by the way, that's on both sides of the aisle. In Kansas, it's more Republican because of the registration in our particular state. When Jim Slattery and I ran for Congress, the Republicans had an edge on registration, but it wasn't so overwhelming, and our districts were also reasonably balanced. It's just something that I think the people of Kansas should demand in this process. Otherwise, it will go to the courts. Federal courts will draw congressional districts, and that's not what the Founding Fathers had in mind. But they'll do it if this process is not fair.
Okay, other questions? We have a question on the front row up here. If you have a question, kind of raise your hand, and so one of our students with a microphone can stake themselves out next to you. Go right ahead.
Sir, Patrick Schmidt, you mentioned January 6th. Do you think there's still a specter of political violence hanging around this country, and what are the prospects of drawing that back?
Are you the Patrick Schmidt that's a congressional candidate?
Guilty.
Guilty, okay, all right, okay. So, you know, when I watched that on TV, and, you know, I loved the House. I served there. And I couldn't believe what was happening, that there was such disrespect, however it happened, why it happened. And, you know, thank goodness that good judgment prevailed. You know, a little bit of history. Some of you have heard that Mike Pence, you know, did the right thing. But there was some period of time where we weren't sure what he was going to do. And either he called Dan Quayle or Dan Quayle called him. And he asked him, what do you think I should do? And Quayle said, you don't have a choice, my friend. This is the Constitution of the United States. So maybe history will show that Dan Quayle had a role and I'm serious, in keeping our democracy strong. You never know how these little things are going to work. But yeah, I'm very worried about this. It's so frustrating that some people in Congress are ostracized for saying that what happened on January 6th wasn't seditious, wasn't treasonous, wasn't a direct violation of all the things that we believe in terms of a safe and peaceful continuation of government. But I'm also troubled a little bit, like I'm back to this public health thing on vaccinations. I think there's a lot of similar things right there, and I understand that people have different views on this kind of stuff. But I saw Lindsey Graham, some of you know him, the senator from South Carolina. He spoke to a group, and he says, well, I think you all ought to get vaccinated. He was just about booed out of the room for talking like this. We've lost 750,000 people dead because of COVID. Over 6,000 in the state of Kansas because of COVID. And then Lindsey backed down a little bit. He says, well, I just think you should consider being vaccinated. I'm not saying you had to get vaccinated. And, you know, I'm thinking that the Bible says the truth shall make you free, but I don't know, there's different truths around these days that make life awful difficult. And so what I go back to, and this is not a very simple answer to your question, because yeah, I worry about it. And two, I think that the political leaders need to show some courage. And that's all it counts. And if they lose their job because of it, so be it. And better people will replace them.
Okay.
Name one thing you'd like Congress to do. And it could be legislation or procedural rule or just if you were, you know, king of Congress or whatever.
Yeah, you know, I mean, it's a complex question because the House and the Senate are different places, and you know, I get frustrated. I'm not for abolishing the filibuster, but it does strike me that every Senate vote of any magnitude has to have 60 votes. That's not what the creators of this country intended. That's not majority rule. That's constant supermajority rule. And they ought to do something about this, so that, because that means you've got to have 60 on everything. And it also leads to the fact how one senator can stop the process. So one senator today, Senator Cruz, has prevented most ambassadors from getting confirmed. We have the lowest rate of ambassador confirmations in history right now. And it's being held up because of an unrelated issue involving natural gas sales to Russia. Okay. So, you know, I'm not saying that the Senate is all the problem, because it's not. But a lot of these are structural issues that have to do with the nature of how the United States Senate works. That would not have, I don't think that would have happened under Dole leadership. I mean, he had to deal with some of these issues, but he would try to work it out the best that, you know, he possibly could. So that's certainly one, one example. There are probably lots of things that, if I were to sit down and think about it, how Congress could improve itself. But that would be something. I'm much more focused in terms of how the Senate operates right now. And so that's my best answer to your question.
Okay.
The president is restricted to 2 terms. What are your views on restricting Congress and the Senate and congressional House members to 2 terms or whatever?
I promised when I was elected that I would only serve 6 terms, 12 years. And when I ran for my 7th term, I said, we really need experience in this place, and so, I'm not, I'm not as hung up on term limits as I used to be. I think we need to make our elections more fair, our redistricting process more fair. I see a lot of the same problems with younger members in the current system that I see with long-term members. I do think, however, that we need to look at the length of terms of people who serve on the Supreme Court. I don't know how a judge feels about that. I'm not exactly sure what it should be, but this lifetime appointment, forever and ever and ever, until people serve in their 80s and 90s, I think is probably not healthy for the country. I think certainly a very extended period of time is good, but I think that's an issue that I think I wouldn't want to make any provocative over-the-top suggestions about how to do it. And I think that there are some other reforms. Rotating people off committee chairmanships is a good idea. Preventing committee chairmen from raising PAC money as chairman of the committee, in a sense, that they can then dole out to people on their committee. I mean, there are things that can be done to maybe equalize the system better. But I don't know, oftentimes it's said if you have term limits in Congress, all that means is, are you going to have term limits for their staff? Because if you don't, staff will have the real power in the system. I don't think that's necessarily what we want to say too. I mean, ultimately, the people need to exercise their power and their right to get much more engaged in the American political process and to change their congressman if they don't think he or she is doing the right job. And I think Pogo said we have met the enemy and he is us. And sometimes I think that's true as well. So I'm not blaming you all. I'm just saying that there's lots of things that are going around that will make a difference here.
Okay, we have a question back here.
Talk, please, about the family farm and the likelihood of it surviving, especially for those that are operating on less than a whole section, when we consumers want to go to giant mega grocery stores and buy whatever we want anytime through the year at the cheapest price.
Well, it's a very good question. I'm glad you asked it. It's a big public policy question. As recently as 1950, we had about 5% of the people in this country actually being what's called full-time farm operators, maybe slightly more. Today it's about 1% are full-time operators. I mean, agriculture has become so much more productive, and the scale of agriculture has increased dramatically, and we haven't done a very good job of figuring out how to keep people on the land and make a living on the land, and so younger people then leave the farms, go to the cities, and then farms get aggregated, get bigger and bigger and bigger. So these are really big structural issues. But there are a couple things I think Congress is looking at now. One is the livestock industry. The livestock business, beef, pork, and poultry, is largely concentrated in 3 or 4 operators. And so they're looking now at the antitrust laws to see if there are things we can do. The second thing is our diets are changing. Now, this is remarkable. So people are eating different these days. A lot of it has to do with the relationship between diet, nutrition, and health. And so, you can grow, there's all sorts of innovation in agriculture now. I was meeting with Jim on a related issue, but you can grow fruits and vegetables almost anywhere in the country, indoor agriculture. You can even grow a lot of it outdoor agriculture. Farmers are becoming more diversified than they ever were before. It used to be in Kansas, you grew wheat and you raised cattle. And that's probably not a key to success for an average-sized family farmer anymore, given the scale of farming and the costs of farming. And agriculture has to change to meet and adapt those things. But there's a lot of changes happening right now. And I go back to people's diets are changing. A lot more people are interested in food than they used to be. And the other thing is, if you were to ask me what's the most important force in agriculture today, well, I would say the consumer is the most important force in agriculture today. The consumer will decide what the stores will buy and what people will grow. And it's changing right before our eyes. And that can be a positive thing for innovative farmers, particularly younger farmers who can meet that. It's going to be tougher for older farmers that have practiced agriculture a certain way all of their life. But there are a lot of opportunities in agriculture now. Agriculture can also be a big contributor to reducing carbon in the atmosphere. And you can actually we might pay farmers in the future for doing that, which is not a bad thing, to be honest with you. It just may help in the whole climate debate. So good question. I wish I could answer it more thoroughly and thoughtfully, but I'm glad you raised it.
Okay, we have a question back here.
Hi, Dan. It's your editor, David. I was pleased to see you finally in person after working with you on your book. And I just wanted to ask about your process of turning your life into the book and what you learned about your career, your life in the process of putting it onto the page. What things you have to leave out? What things would like to maybe say more about your life that we weren't able to be in the book?
Well, first of all, thanks to you and thanks to the folks at KU Press for helping getting this done. I talk a little bit about my family. I was honest about my family. I wasn't 100% thorough about my family because every family has got their own unique characteristics, and sometimes I think I could have done more on that, but I'm not sure that served any purpose. And I think if people read through the lines, they can see a lot how impactful my family was in my entire process, because most political people and most people generally are beneficiaries of what their parents were and what they were all about. The problem with writing a book is that after you finished it, you remember 73 things that you did that you wish you would have written about and wish you would have put in there. But there's not going to be another book because this one took me a very long time to do, and my wife thinks it cost me about $1,200 in total cost to get this book done. And there are certain things you don't tell your spouse about. Please, reporters, don't write this. But anyway, it's a tough, long process unless you're a natural writer, which I am not. I'm a better editor than I am a writer. But I did think it was important to show the diversity of my career, because I think that you don't have to keep the same job forever in life if you're not happy. And also, not every job involves making more and more and more money, although money is good, especially when you're starting out. But I probably could have been a little more philosophical in terms of some of those issues. But I didn't want to turn this book into a burning partisan indictment of, let's say, the other side of the aisle, because there's plenty of blame and barnacles on both sides of our political system today. I just wanted to show that politics can be positive and can be fun. It can be a happy experience if people want it to be.
Do we have any other questions tonight? Got time for another question or two if you want to ask. Put your hand up. In that case, Secretary Dan Glickman, I want to thank you very much for coming to the Dole Institute. I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. I want to remind you that we're doing a book sale and book signing. Christmas is just around the corner, You're probably have heard, but if you keep up with the news, a lot of things aren't going to be available at Christmas, but we've got Dan's book,
Yeah.
and we've got it here tonight, and
The-
we'll sell them till the cows
The
come home.
the supply chain stops at the Dole Institute, right? Yeah, that's right.
Exactly. So anyway, thanks to everybody for coming out. Would encourage you to come for our program next Tuesday that Audrey described, and we'll see you next time you're here. Thank you all very
Yeah,
much.
okay, thank you.